Your opinions don't matter, Grandma. This is my county, remember that. Officer Arnie Belton leaned down until his face was inches from Pearl Durnell's, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. The diner had gone completely still. 30 people. Not one of them moved. Pearl's hand pressed flat against his chest, firm, steady, and unshaken. Belton's laugh was slow and ugly. His fingers curled at his side. Outside in the parking lot, a car had been sitting for 4 minutes. The driver, Pearl's son, had traveled 14 hours. He had a card in his jacket pocket, and a smile meant for his mother. Arnie Belton had no idea that Smile was already gone. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The coffee at Mabel's Diner was always perfect on Saturday mornings. Pearl Durnell had been coming here long enough to know that. 30 years of Saturdays, rain or shine, and she had never once sat anywhere other than table 4, the small round table by the front window, where the morning light came through at just the right angle and you could see the whole length of Auburn Street without even trying. She wrapped both hands around her mug and looked out at Reedside waking up. This neighborhood was hers. She had taught 3 generations of its children. She had buried her husband from its church. She had watched its oak trees grow thick enough to shade the whole sidewalk. Reedside was not just where Pearl Durnell lived. It was what she was made of. "Pearl, I am telling you," said Ruthie Monroe, dropping her fork on her plate for emphasis, "that man cannot cook a pot of greens to save his life." Brian Stewart straightened in his chair, deeply offended. "Those were the best greens you've ever tasted in your life, and you know it." "Brian." Ruthie looked at him with patient pity. "Baby, they were gray." Pearl laughed, a full, real laugh that warmed the whole table. Ruthie and Brian had been doing this for 25 years, and it never got old. That was the thing about Table 4 on a Saturday morning. Nothing here was ever old. It was always exactly what it needed to be. Mabel's was full the way it always was this time of morning. The booths along the back wall were packed with families and regulars. The counter stools were all taken. Someone had the gospel station low on the radio behind the kitchen window. And the smell coming out of that kitchen, biscuits and butter and something with onions and heat, was the kind of smell that made you feel like the world was, at its core, going to be all right. Pearl had walked these floors since before her son Brandon was born. She had cried here after her husband's funeral. She had celebrated Brandon's Navy commissioning right here at this table, with Ruthie and Brian and half the neighborhood crowded into the space. Mabel's was not just a diner. It was a record of their lives. She was raising her mug for another sip when the door opened. The man who walked in was not a regular. Pearl knew all the regulars. This man was in uniform. Millhaven County Sheriff's Department, tan and brown, the badge catching the morning light. He was big, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had settled permanently into a look of mild contempt. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to, eyes moving across the room like he was doing an inventory. Officer Arnie Belton. Pearl recognized him. Most people in Reedside did. He had been on the force for 17 years, which in Millhaven County meant he had 17 years of getting away with things. He was not here for breakfast. Pearl could tell that immediately. His hand was already at his belt, his chin already lifted. He moved through the diner the way certain men moved through spaces they had decided belonged to them. He stopped at table 4. "Y'all are going to need to keep it down," he said. No greeting. No introduction. Just that, flat and final, like he was reading from a script he'd already memorized. Pearl set her mug down slowly. Around the diner, conversations dropped. Heads turned. The gospel on the radio kept going, soft and unbothered. "Good morning, officer," Pearl said. Her voice was even, measured. The same voice she had used for 40 years in a classroom when a student tried to be clever. "We are speaking at a perfectly normal volume, same as everyone else in here." Belton's eyes moved to her, stayed there. "I'm not asking," he said. "And I'm not arguing," Pearl replied. "I'm simply stating a fact. If you have a complaint, the owner is in the kitchen. Her name is Mabel. I'm sure she'd be happy to speak with you." Brian had gone very still. Ruthie's hand found the edge of the table. Belton didn't move, didn't look toward the kitchen, didn't acknowledge anything Pearl had said. He just stood there, looking down at her, and something in his expression shifted. The performance faded. What replaced it was quieter and much worse. His eyes told her everything. "I don't have to listen to you." Pearl held his gaze and did not look away. She had not looked away from a bully in 67 years, and she was not about to start now. Belton leaned down. He brought his face close to Pearl's, close enough that she could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and his voice dropped to something low and private, meant only for her table. "You people always got to make things difficult," he said. "Can't just follow a simple instruction. Always got to have an audience." His lip curled. "Sit there with your little coffee and your little opinions like any of it matters. You're in my county, Grandma. You do well to remember that." Ruthie made a sharp sound, a short, involuntary intake of breath, like she'd been struck. Brian Stewart pushed back his chair. "Now, just a minute. Sit down, old man." Belton didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Pearl. "I'm not talking to you." The diner had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a peaceful morning. A held-breath quiet. The kind that fills a room when something is about to go very wrong. The gospel on the radio kept playing, low and steady, completely unaware. Pearl did not move. She looked up at Arnie Belton with the same expression she had used on 30 years of children who thought they could rattle her. Calm. Absolute. Unbroken. She had been called worse things than what he had just implied. She had survived worse men than this one. And she was not, under any circumstances, going to give him the satisfaction of her fear. She stood up slowly. Not fast. Not dramatic. Just steady. The way she did everything. She rose from her chair until she was standing in front of him. She was 5'4", and he had nearly a foot on her, and none of that mattered at all. And she placed her hand flat against his chest. Not a push. Not a strike. A boundary. "Step back," she said. Belton looked down at her hand, then back at her face. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't crumbled. Then something uglier replaced it. He slapped her. Open palm. Full force. Across the left side of her face. The sound of it cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Pearl's head turned with the impact. Her hand dropped from his chest. For one terrible second, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. The families in the booths, the regulars at the counter, Mabel, who had appeared at the kitchen window at exactly the wrong moment, Ruthie with both hands pressed to her mouth, Brian Stewart half out of his chair and frozen there. At the counter, a 16-year-old named Maya had been holding her phone up for the last 30 seconds. She had started recording when Belton leaned into Pearl's face, not because she thought anything serious would happen, just the way teenagers record things that feel tense and strange. Her phone was still running. The slap was on it. Every second of it, in full, devastating clarity. Pearl did not fall. She did not cry out. She did not make a sound. She straightened. Slowly, with complete control, she raised her hand and touched her own cheek. Just once, lightly, like she was confirming something to herself. Then she lowered her hand, and she looked at Arnie Belton. The expression on her face was not anger. It was not pain. It was something far worse for a man like Belton, something he clearly hadn't prepared for. It was calm, complete, total, absolute calm. The kind that doesn't come from not feeling anything. The kind that comes from feeling everything and deciding none of it will break you. Her eyes were steady and clear, and they were locked on his face, and they did not waver by a single degree. Belton blinked. For just one moment, one small, telling moment, he looked uncertain, like a man who had expected a very specific reaction and received something else entirely, something he didn't have a script for. Then his hand moved to his radio. "Dispatch," he said, his voice already reshaping itself, already building the version of events he intended to tell. "I've got a situation at Mabel's Diner on Auburn. Civilian made physical contact with an officer. I responded to the threat." He said it smoothly, practiced, the way men like Belton always had a story ready before the dust had even settled. Pearl's eyes never left his face. The diner remained completely, utterly still. And then, behind Arnie Belton's broad shoulders, the front door of Mabel's Diner swung open. Brandon Durnell had been in the parking lot for 4 minutes. He had driven 14 hours straight from Virginia Beach, stopped twice, once for gas outside of Savannah, and once just to sit in a rest stop parking lot because he couldn't stop smiling. He needed to compose himself before he walked in. He had a card in his jacket pocket. He had been rehearsing what he was going to say for the last 100 miles. Something like, "Surprise, Mama. I'm home." Simple. He had never been good at big, dramatic gestures. His mother always said she could read him like a first-grade textbook anyway. He had sat in his car for 4 minutes, watching the morning light on Auburn Street, thinking about how much he had missed this neighborhood. 8 months since he had last seen her, and he had missed her every single day, the way you miss something that is the actual foundation of you. He got out of the car, straightened his jacket, and walked to the front door. He pushed it open. He understood everything in under 2 seconds. He had been trained to read a room. Threat assessment, they called it in the Navy. But it was really just learning to see everything at once and process it before most people had finished blinking. He saw the frozen families in the booths. He saw Brian Stewart half out of his chair. He saw Ruthie's hands pressed to her face. He saw the big man in the sheriff's uniform with his hand on his radio. And he saw his mother, the redness on her left cheek, the careful, deliberate way she was holding herself upright, the hand she had just lowered from her own face. Brandon didn't need anyone to tell him what had happened. The card in his pocket ceased to exist. Every thought in his head cleared out completely, the way a room empties before a storm. And what was left was very simple and very quiet. He crossed the diner. Belton heard the footsteps and spun around. He got his first look at Brandon. 6 feet of quiet, controlled, absolute stillness. And his hand dropped instinctively to his belt. "Back up," Belton said. "Right now. That woman is my mother." Brandon's voice was low and even. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood there, and somehow that stillness was more unsettling than anything Belton had prepared for. "You put your hand across her face." Belton's eyes flicked to Pearl. Then back to Brandon. He took a slow step forward. The walk of a man who had used his size to end conversations for 17 years. "I don't know who you think you are," Belton said, "but you need to turn yourself around, walk back out that door, and let me do my job before I make your morning a whole lot worse." "Step away from her," Brandon said. Simple. Final. Belton stared at him, his chin lifted. 2 feet of space between them now. "Are we understanding each other, boy?" The word landed in the diner like something thrown. Ruthie closed her eyes. Brian Stewart's hand curled into a fist on the tabletop. Mabel appeared at the kitchen window and went completely still. Brandon didn't flinch, didn't blink. He had been called worse things in worse places by worse men. "Step away from her," he said again. Belton couldn't tolerate it. 17 years of unchecked authority had rewired something fundamental in him. And this, a man who simply would not move, would not blink, would not give him anything, was more than he could process. He drew back his fist and threw a punch straight at Brandon's face. It was a big punch, powerful, the kind that had put men on the floor before. Brandon slipped it. One small, precise movement, barely an inch left, and Belton's fist sailed past his ear close enough to feel the air from it. The momentum pulled Belton a half-step forward, off balance, exposed. Brandon hit him once, one straight right hand, compact, devastating. It landed flush on Belton's jaw with a crack that silenced every last sound in the diner. Belton's legs went sideways. He stumbled back hard into the counter, grabbed it with both hands, and hung there. Hat on the floor, radio skidding across the linoleum, blinking at nothing. Brandon stood exactly where he had been. He hadn't chased, hadn't swung again. Feet planted, hands loose, breathing steady. "Don't touch her," he said. "Don't touch me. Don't move." He turned to his mother. He raised both hands slowly and cupped her face, one palm on each side, gentle as anything, and looked at her cheek. Then he looked into her eyes and said something low, just between the two of them, that no camera ever captured. Pearl closed her eyes, just for a moment. Her shoulders dropped half an inch, like she'd been carrying something heavy and had finally been given permission to set it down. "My name is Senior Chief Petty Officer Brandon Durnell, United States Navy." He spoke clearly to the room without letting go of his mother's face. "Someone please call 911. I am unarmed. I am not leaving. And I would like to report an assault." Across the counter, Maya's hand tightened around her phone. She had been recording the whole time. The first patrol car arrived in 4 minutes, then a second, then a third. They came in fast, pulling up onto the curb outside Mabel's with their lights going, and the officers who climbed out moved with the practiced urgency of men who had received a very specific kind of call. Not civilian assaulted, not woman struck by officer, but officer down. Brandon stood where he had been standing since he made his announcement. Hands visible, feet planted. Pearl beside him, her chin up, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. The officers came through the door and went straight to Belton. Nobody looked at Pearl's cheek. Nobody asked her what happened. Chris Harvin arrived 7 minutes after the first patrol car. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, built like a man who had once been athletic and had since made peace with not being any more. He wore his uniform like it was a business suit, perfectly pressed, completely comfortable. And he walked into Mabel's diner the way he walked into every room in Millhaven County, like it already belonged to him. He passed Pearl Durnell without a glance, didn't look at her face, didn't slow down, didn't acknowledge that she was standing there with a handprint still visible on her left cheek. He walked past her the way you walk past furniture, and went straight to Belton, who was sitting on a counter stool with a cold pack someone had found pressed to his jaw. Harvin looked at Belton. Then he turned and looked at Brandon with a flatness that said everything and required no translation whatsoever. "I know exactly what happened here. I don't care." "Cuff him," Harvin said. 2 officers moved to Brandon immediately. Brandon put his hands behind his back without being asked. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't say a single word. He turned his head once, just once, to look at his mother. Pearl met his eyes and gave him one small, firm nod. I'm all right. Go. Outside, a local news camera had appeared. A reporter and a cameraman from Channel 4, who had been 2 blocks away covering a completely unrelated Saturday morning segment when the dispatch chatter started. Harvin stepped out in front of them, while Brandon was still being processed inside. Officer Belton responded this morning to a complaint at this establishment, Harvin said, his voice calm and official and smooth as polished wood. He was conducting routine business when he was physically assaulted by a civilian. Our department takes the safety of its officers with the utmost seriousness. A full internal review will be conducted. A brief pause. We appreciate the community's patience. He said it all without blinking, without hesitation, like he had written the statement in his head on the drive over. Inside, Jenny Dale was pushing through the diner door. Pearl had called her before the second patrol car even arrived. One short call, 3 words. Mabel's. Come now. Jenny had her camera around her neck and a notebook in her hand before she was out of her car. She moved through the diner quickly, photographing everything. Belton on the stool. The officers surrounding Brandon. Pearl's face. She made sure to get Pearl's face, the cheek, the angle of the light. Everything sharp and documented and undeniable. She filed Pearl's assault complaint on the spot, wrote it out by hand, signed as a witness, pressed it into the hands of the youngest officer in the room. He took it, looked at Harvin's back through the window. By the following morning, that complaint would be stamped under review pending investigation and placed in a drawer where it would not move again unless someone with more authority than Millhaven County forced it to. Brandon was walked out through the diner in handcuffs. He held his head straight and his shoulders square, and he looked at no one except his mother as he passed her table. He asked one thing from the officer at his right elbow, one request in the same level voice he had used since he walked through the door. I need to make a phone call. At the precinct, they processed him efficiently, photographed him, fingerprinted him, logged his belongings, wallet, keys, the card he had bought for his mother, still in his jacket pocket, unsent. He sat in the booking room and waited. And when they finally handed him a phone, he dialed from memory. Commander David Monroe picked up on the second ring. Outside the precinct, Pearl Durnell stood on the sidewalk and did not go home. Jenny stood beside her. They didn't talk much. The evening came on slowly, the October air turning cool, the streetlights flickering on one by one along the block. Around 8 o'clock, Brian Stewart appeared with 3 paper cups of coffee from Mabel's, still warm. He handed one to Pearl. She took it with both hands. She did not leave. D.A. Wilbert Rush made his statement at 9 o'clock that night. He stood at a podium in the county building's front lobby. Small man, careful suit, the kind of face that had never once in its life committed to an expression. And he read from a prepared sheet of paper without looking up. The Millhaven County District Attorney's Office has reviewed the events of this morning and will be pursuing full prosecution of Brandon Durnell on 1 count of felony assault of a law enforcement officer and 1 count of criminal obstruction. He flipped the page. We take violence against our officers with the utmost seriousness. This case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent the law allows. He did not mention Pearl. He did not mention the slap. He folded his paper, nodded at no one, and walked back through the lobby doors. No questions. No room for them. Outside the precinct, Pearl heard it through Jenny's phone. She stood very still while it played, her cup of coffee from Brian held in both hands, and she listened to every word Wilbert Rush said. When it was done, she handed the phone back to Jenny without comment. 7 years. That was what full prosecution meant. 7 years, and Brandon's pension gone, his military record gutted, 18 years of service reduced to nothing. She did not cry. She drank her coffee. By 10 o'clock, Jenny had finally convinced her to go home. Pearl did not argue. Not because she was ready to leave, but because she understood that standing on a sidewalk in the dark was not a strategy. And Pearl Durnell had always known the difference between grief and surrender. She allowed herself the sidewalk. She would not allow herself the surrender. At home, she sat at her kitchen table with an ice pack pressed to her left cheek and her laptop open in front of her. The original video was everywhere. Maya's live stream, pulled from the platform and re-uploaded dozens of times across every social media site that existed, had hit 4.2 million views before midnight. The comments were an ocean of fury and solidarity. Former students of Pearl's were posting photographs with her. Veterans were sharing Brandon's service record. The hashtag with her name had been trending for 6 hours. For a little while, sitting in her quiet kitchen, Pearl let herself feel the weight of that. All those people. All those voices. It meant something. It genuinely meant something. Then she found the second video. It was circulating through local Facebook groups, Millhaven community pages, county residents' boards, the kinds of online spaces where the same 300 people argued about road repairs and school board meetings. Someone had clipped the original footage, deliberately, carefully, with obvious purpose. The clip began at the 20-second mark, showing Brandon moving toward Belton, Brandon's hands on Belton, Brandon standing over Belton on the floor. 30 seconds of footage, not 1 second of what came before it. No approach, no leaning in, no whispered words that made Ruthie gasp, no hand flat on Pearl's chest, no slap, just a black man taking down a white police officer. Nothing else. The comments filled fast. We don't know the full story. The woman was clearly agitated. He attacked a cop unprovoked. There's no excuse. Why is everyone making this racial? The posts spread outward from the local pages, jumped to county groups, then to larger statewide pages, each share adding a little more distance from the truth. Pearl read them. She made herself read everyone. She needed to know exactly what she was dealing with. She set the ice pack on the table. 3 blocks away, the lights were still on at Cornerstone Baptist. Reverend Aldridge had opened the church at 7 that evening, and people had been coming and going ever since. Neighbors, former students, families who had known Pearl and Brandon for decades. There was no formal service. Just people who needed somewhere to be, gathered together in the place they always gathered when things went wrong. Pearl knew because Ruthie had called to tell her. Ruthie had also said, "You should come, Pearl. People need to see you." Pearl had said, "Tell them I'm fine. Tell them to go home and rest. We've got more work ahead of us than they know." She closed her laptop. The kitchen was very quiet. The ice pack sat melting on the table beside her untouched dinner. Outside, Millhaven was still, the ordinary, indifferent stillness of a town that had gone to sleep while her son sat in a cell 8 blocks away. For the first time in a very long time, Pearl Durnell was afraid. Not of Arnie Belton, not of Chris Harvin, not of Wilbert Rush and his prepared statements and his careful suits. She was afraid of the edited video. She was afraid of the 300 people in the comment sections who had already decided what they believed. She was afraid of how quickly a lie could travel when the truth was inconvenient for the people with the power to carry it. She sat with that fear for exactly 5 minutes. Then she picked up her phone and called Jenny. Sunday morning came gray and cold. Pearl was up before the sun. She had slept maybe 3 hours, not from despair, but from the particular restlessness of a mind that refused to stop working. She made coffee, sat at her kitchen table, and started making calls at 7 o'clock. The first attorney she reached listened politely until she said the name Chris Harvin. Then he said he had a conflict of interest and wished her well. The second didn't bother with politeness. He simply said the case wasn't a good fit for his practice and ended the call in under a minute. The third listened longer. He asked thoughtful questions. He seemed genuinely troubled by what she described. Then he said, $30,000. Retainer. Due before he filed a single piece of paper. Pearl thanked him and hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment. $30,000. She had her teacher's pension, her savings, the small amount her husband had left behind. She could pull together maybe $8,000 without touching the emergency fund she kept for exactly the kind of emergency that might still be coming. She wrote the number down on a piece of paper, folded it, and set it aside. Not as a defeat, as information. She would need to know the shape of every obstacle before she could figure out how to get around it. By 9 o'clock, she was at the precinct. They told her Brandon had been assigned a public defender. Her name was Keisha Norwood, 28 years old, 11 months out of law school, with a caseload that was already 90 cases past what any one person could reasonably manage. Pearl met her in the precinct lobby, a young woman in a good blazer, carrying a bag that was too heavy for her shoulders. Keisha Norwood looked at Pearl with honest, exhausted eyes and said, "Mrs. Durnell, I am going to do everything I can. But I need you to understand. This DA has a 20-year relationship with Judge Pickett, who has been assigned to the preliminary hearing. I don't know how to beat that. Not alone, and not quickly." Pearl appreciated the honesty more than she would have appreciated false comfort. "Then we find someone who does," Pearl said. She spent Sunday afternoon at Cornerstone Baptist, where Reverend Aldridge had organized the first formal community meeting. The pews were packed, 300 people or more, shoulder to shoulder, the kind of turnout that only happened when something had struck the neighborhood in a place it could not ignore. Aldridge had the floor, steady and measured, directing people toward constructive action. A petition, legal defense fundraising, a coordinated media presence. By Sunday evening, the petition had 4,000 signatures. By Monday morning, it had 12,000. Monday afternoon, a delegation of 15 people, led by Reverend Aldridge, with Pearl standing quietly at his shoulder, carried printed copies of the petition to the county commissioner's office and delivered them to the receptionist, who accepted them with a practiced smile and said the commissioners would review everything in due course. The commissioners met Tuesday morning and tabled the petition without discussion. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Tuesday morning, Belton returned to the sheriff's department. Desk duty, officially. That was what Harvin's office told the two reporters who called to ask. But at noon on Tuesday, Jenny was driving past the Millhaven Golf and Country Club when she saw Harvin's department vehicle in the parking lot. She pulled over. She waited. 40 minutes later, Harvin and Belton walked out of the clubhouse together. Belton in civilian clothes, both of them with the easy, unhurried movement of men who had just eaten a good lunch and had no pressing concerns about anything. Jenny photographed them from her car. That evening she posted it to the Millhaven Courier's online page with a single caption, "Arnie Belton, currently on desk duty following Saturday's incident, photographed Tuesday afternoon at the Millhaven Golf and Country Club." The post was shared 900 times before midnight. Pearl read it at her kitchen table. The same chair, the same cold coffee. She had been coming home to this table every evening now, like it was a command post. Ruthie had brought food twice. Both times Pearl had eaten without tasting it, already thinking about the next morning. She understood something clearly that most people in the comment sections were still catching up to. The petition didn't matter. The posts didn't matter. The 900 shares didn't matter. Harvin had a judge. Harvin had a DA. Harvin had 17 years of machinery that had been built specifically to handle situations like this one, to absorb public outrage, process it slowly, and spit out nothing. Outrage without leverage was just noise. Pearl needed leverage. She picked up her phone and called Jenny. Wednesday morning, the courthouse steps were full. More people than Tuesday. More than Monday. They stretched down the front steps and along the sidewalk in both directions. Cornerstone Baptist members in their Sunday coats, young people with handwritten signs, older men and women who had been in Reedside longer than the courthouse itself had been standing. Reverend Aldridge was at the front, steady and dignified, keeping things peaceful and purposeful. By 9 o'clock, Harvin had deployed 6 additional deputies to the area. He called it public safety management. He said so in a statement released through the department's communications office. Brief, bureaucratic, designed to sound reasonable to anyone who wasn't paying close enough attention to what it actually meant. What it meant was this: keep moving, keep watching, and wait for someone to make a mistake. They didn't have to wait long. At 10:15, 2 young men crossing Broad Street at the corner nearest the courthouse were stopped by 2 deputies. The crossing signal had just turned. Both men had 1 foot off the curb when the officers reached them. Their names were taken, their IDs checked. They were cited for jaywalking and issued notices to appear. One of them was 22. The other was Deshaun Carter, 19 years old, Pearl's former student, the young man who had stayed after class 3 times a week in 9th grade because he was struggling with reading comprehension and too proud to ask for help during school hours. Pearl had never told anyone about those sessions. Neither had Deshaun. The arrests, because that's what they were, regardless of what the citation forms called them, spread through the protest crowd within minutes. Not panic. Something colder. The particular, bone-deep exhaustion of a community that had seen this exact move before and knew precisely what it meant. This is what happens when you make noise. We can touch anyone we want. Pearl heard about Deshaun before noon. Ruthie called her, then Reverend Aldridge, then Deshaun's mother Sandra called herself. Voice tight and controlled, the way women in Reedside had learned to be tight and controlled when they were actually terrified. Pearl was at Sandra Carter's house by 1 o'clock. She sat at Sandra's kitchen table, a smaller, dimmer version of her own, and drank the coffee Sandra made because making coffee was something useful to do with shaking hands. Deshaun sat across from them, citation on the table in front of him, jaw set and eyes hard with a particular kind of anger that Pearl recognized immediately. She had seen it in Brandon's eyes once, years ago. She had worked very hard back then to make sure that anger found the right channel. "You did nothing wrong," Pearl told him, clearly, directly. "And this is not the end of the story." Deshaun looked at the citation. "Feels like they can just do whatever they want." "They've felt that way for a long time," Pearl said. "That's different from it being true." She stayed for an hour. On the drive home, she passed Mabel's diner, the window still intact, the door propped open, the smell of the kitchen drifting out onto Auburn Street, and felt something steady and certain move through her chest. Not this. Not while I'm breathing. By 5 o'clock, the calls started coming into Mabel's. Anonymous. Short. The voice on the first call said, "Tell Pearl Durnell to go home and stay there." The second call said nothing at all, just breathing, then a hang-up. Mabel documented each one in her order notebook, writing down the time and what was said, in the same handwriting she used for the lunch specials. At 7:15, the brick came through the front window of the Millhaven Courier. It hit the display case just inside the entrance, bounced off the glass counter, and came to rest against the far wall. No one was hurt. Jenny had been in the back office when it happened, and came out to find the window in pieces on the floor, the October night air pouring through the gap. She stood in the middle of her office for one moment, just one. Then she got her camera. She photographed the window, the brick, the broken glass. the hole in the display case. She called the police and filed a report, calmly, thoroughly, knowing exactly how far that report would travel. She taped a piece of cardboard over the window herself, with packaging tape from the supply closet. Then she called Pearl. Pearl arrived at her own front door at 8:45 to find an envelope on the mat. No stamp, no return address, hand-delivered. She picked it up, went inside, sat down at her kitchen table, and opened it. The note was short, typed, printed on plain white paper. Drop this. Sell the building. This neighborhood is changing whether you want it to or not. Pearl read it once, read it again. Then she folded it carefully, precise, even creases, slid it back into the envelope, and sealed it shut. She did not call the police. She called Jenny. The cardboard over the Millhaven Courier's front window shifted slightly in the night breeze, the tape at its edges lifting and resettling with a soft, persistent sound. Pearl pushed through the door at 9 o'clock, envelope in hand. The broken glass had been swept up, but the display case was still cracked, a long diagonal fracture running from corner to corner. Jenny was at her desk in the back office, laptop open, 2 cups of coffee already poured. She looked up when Pearl came in. Her eyes went to the envelope. "Close the door," Jenny said. Pearl sat down across from her oldest friend, placed the envelope on the desk between them, and waited. Jenny didn't open it immediately. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned her laptop around so the screen faced Pearl and said, "Before you show me that, I need to show you something first." The screen was filled with documents, spreadsheets, scanned forms, photographs, PDFs layered over one another in organized folders whose labels Pearl couldn't fully read from where she sat. Jenny reached over and opened the first folder. 14 months, Jenny said. "That's how long I've been building this." She walked Pearl through it methodically, the way she had always written, clear, precise, nothing wasted. The first document was a complaint form. Excessive force, filed 18 months ago by a man named Robert Gaines, 54 years old, who said Belton had slammed him against his own car during a traffic stop on Wheeler Road. Gaines had a cracked rib. He had photographs. He had filed the complaint through proper channels. The complaint had gone into Harvin's internal review process and never come back out. 6 months later, Gaines had signed a non-disclosure agreement and received a payment of $8,000 from a county discretionary fund. He had not spoken publicly since. "There are 2 more, Jenny said. She opened them both. Both involved black residents. Both involved Belton. Both had been buried in the same internal review drawer and settled through the same discretionary fund. Pearl looked at each document without speaking. Then Jenny opened a different folder entirely. "This," she said, "is Preston Dillon." The name settled over the room like a weather change. Preston Dillon, 52. Founder and principal of Dillon Development Partners, headquartered in Atlanta with a regional office in Millhaven. In the last 3 years, his firm had acquired 14 properties in and around Reedside, mostly through what looked like willing sales. But Jenny had talked to 7 of the sellers, and not one of them had felt willing. They had felt exhausted, ground down by months of noise complaints, health code citations, sudden zoning questions, parking enforcement that targeted their customers and nobody else. Jenny had traced every single one of those complaints back to the same source. Dillon's property management firm had filed them. Every one. "He has county approval for a $47 million development," Jenny said. She pulled up the Planning Commission documents. "Luxury condominiums, mixed-use retail, 312 units." She pointed to the site map on the screen. "Right here. Auburn and 5th. Pearl looked at the map for a long moment. Auburn and 5th. The corner where Mabel's had stood since 1967. The corner where Pearl's church held its annual block party every June. The corner that was, as far as Pearl Durnell was concerned, the actual center of the world. "Belton isn't just a bad cop," Jenny said quietly. "He's Dillon's enforcement. And Harvin isn't just corrupt, he's the reason none of it is on record." She paused. "The discretionary fund that paid off Belton's victims? Partially backed through a non-profit shell company that Dillon's firm funds." Pearl was quiet for a long moment. The cardboard on the window shifted again in the breeze. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Long enough to know I couldn't print it alone." Jenny closed the laptop halfway. "A county newspaper printing this without federal backing. Dillon's attorneys would bury us before the ink dried. I needed someone with more reach." She folded her hands on the desk. 11 months ago, I made contact with a federal civil rights investigator. Her name is Agent Simone Barker. She's been building a parallel case. She has her own documentation, her own sources." Jenny looked directly at Pearl. "What she's been missing is something visible. Something documented and undeniable and already on every screen in the country." A pause. "What happened to you and Brandon on Saturday? That's the piece she's been waiting for." Pearl picked up the envelope from the desk and set it open in front of Jenny. Jenny read the note without touching it. The two women sat in the boarded-up office in the quiet of Wednesday night. Outside, Millhaven was dark and still. "Brandon is in a cell right now," Pearl said. Jenny looked up. "I know." She reached over and gently closed the laptop. "That's why we move faster than I planned." Friday morning, 1 week after the incident. Pearl was at her kitchen table when the cars pulled into Millhaven. She didn't see them arrive. Jenny called her at 9:45 and said, "Turn on your television." Pearl turned it on and saw the Channel 4 news van parked outside the county courthouse, and 3 dark sedans she didn't recognize lined up along the curb behind it. She was out the door in 4 minutes. Almond Clover was standing on the courthouse steps when Pearl arrived. He was 55 years old, medium height, with close-cropped silver at his temples, and the kind of stillness about him that came from spending decades in rooms where everything depended on not showing your hand too early. He wore a dark suit, no tie, and he was talking on his phone when Pearl walked up. He ended the call when he saw her. "Mrs. Durnell," he said. He extended his hand. "Almond Clover." "I know who you are," Pearl said. "Why are you here?" "Because I was sent a video at 2 in the morning," he said, "and I couldn't sleep after I watched it." He said it simply, without performance. "And because 12 Navy SEALs apparently have my personal email address, which I admit surprised me." Pearl almost smiled. Clover had been former DOJ, a Civil Rights Division attorney for 11 years before going private. He had argued cases that changed things, real things, permanent things. Pearl had looked him up on her phone during the 4-minute drive over. He got to work before noon. The first motion Clover filed was for immediate dismissal on procedural grounds. A tight, precise argument built around the department's failure to properly document Pearl's assault complaint and the conflict of interest issues surrounding Judge Pickett's assignment to the case. The second motion went directly to the Northern District of Georgia's federal court, a request for oversight review, citing potential civil rights violations under federal statute. The judge who received it was the Honorable Margaret Kyler. She granted the review by 2 o'clock. The state charges didn't disappear, but they froze, suspended in place while the federal review process assessed jurisdiction. And with that freeze came something that mattered more than any legal technicality. Brandon walked out of Millhaven County Jail at 4:47 in the afternoon. Pearl was on the steps. She had been there since 3 o'clock, standing with Jenny and Brian Stewart and Ruthie, who had brought a coat for Brandon because Ruthie was constitutionally incapable of anticipating anyone's release from anything without bringing a coat. The October afternoon had turned cold and clear, the kind of sky that looked like it had been scrubbed clean. When the door opened and Brandon came through it, Pearl did not run. She walked, steady and unhurried, the way she did everything. And when she reached him, she put both hands on his face, the same way he had put both hands on hers 7 days ago in Mabel's diner. She looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. He covered her hands with his. That was enough. The reunion lasted the length of the courthouse steps. By the time they reached the bottom, Clover was already on his phone again, and Jenny was photographing everything, not intrusively, but carefully, documenting the moment the way she documented everything, because Jenny Dale understood that truth needed witnesses. The national media picked up the story before dinner. A senator from Georgia issued a public statement demanding an independent investigation before 8 o'clock. Belton was officially moved to paid administrative leave. Harvin's concession to the cameras now pointed at his department. The following morning, Pearl sat down at table 4. Mabel had opened early. The diner was already full when Pearl arrived, not with strangers, but with her people. Regulars, neighbors, former students, faces she had known for 30 years. When she walked in, the room went quiet for just a moment, and then it filled back up with something warm and solid. A national television crew set up quietly in the corner. Pearl sat at table 4 in a pressed blue blouse with her hands folded on the table and spoke for 11 minutes directly into the camera. Her voice was completely steady. Her eyes were clear. The mark on her cheek had faded but had not disappeared entirely, and she did not angle away from the light. "I have been in this community for 50 years, she said. "I taught your children and your children's children. I have buried my husband from this neighborhood's church. I have sat at this table every Saturday morning for 30 years. She paused. "I will not be moved." The interview aired on 4 national networks by evening. For the first time in 8 days, it felt like the tide had turned. Pearl let herself feel that for exactly 1 night. 3 days after Brandon's release, early Sunday morning. Pearl was making breakfast when her phone rang. Jenny. 7:42 a.m., which meant it wasn't good news, because Jenny only called before 8 when something had gone wrong. "The DA filed an amended complaint last night," Jenny said. "They have a witness." Pearl turned off the stove. "Who?" "Man named Gary Sims, 44 years old. Claims he was at Mabel's that Saturday morning." Jenny's voice was tight and controlled. "He's saying you stumbled and fell into Belton. He's saying Brandon attacked Belton before Belton could help you." Pearl stood very still in her kitchen. "He wasn't there," she said. "I know that. You know that. He's not in a single frame of Maya's footage." A pause. "Doesn't matter." He signed a statement. D.A. Rush filed it yesterday evening. Judge Pickett accepted it this morning and scheduled the preliminary hearing for Wednesday. Clover requested a continuance. Pickett denied it. Pearl set her phone on the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the quiet Sunday street. The oak tree in the front yard had started dropping its leaves. She watched one fall. "Call Clover," she said. "I'll be ready." She was ready. But the day was not finished with her yet. By noon, Almond Clover received a formal bar complaint, filed by an Atlanta attorney named Wilbert Marsh, who had represented Dillon Development Partners in 3 separate county zoning cases over the past 4 years. The complaint alleged procedural misconduct in a case Clover had argued in 2021. It was thin. It was transparently retaliatory. It was also, under Bar Association rules, something that required Clover's immediate attention and response, which meant 48 hours of Clover sitting with his malpractice attorney instead of sitting with Brandon's case. Clover called Pearl to tell her himself. "It's a delay tactic," he said. "It will be dismissed. I need you to hold steady for 48 hours. "I've been holding steady for 10 days, Pearl said. 48 hours is nothing. But the day kept going. At 2 o'clock, Clover received word from Judge Kyler's clerk that the federal review had been temporarily suspended. A routine background check had surfaced a minor financial connection. A new clerk's father's accounting firm had processed a single invoice for Dillon Development Partners 2 years prior. The connection was tangential and almost certainly coincidental. It was also, under federal conflict of interest guidelines, sufficient grounds for a formal challenge that pushed Kyler's review back by 2 weeks minimum. 2 weeks. With the preliminary hearing on Wednesday. Jenny called an hour later. Dillon's attorneys had sent formal cease and desist letters to the Millhaven Courier and 3 other outlets that had been running coverage of her Reedside investigation. The letters were aggressive, citing defamation, demanding retraction of published material, threatening immediate legal action. Jenny's voice was steady when she read the key sections aloud to Pearl, but Pearl could hear the weight behind it. Then Thursday came. Harvin stood at a podium outside the sheriff's department at 2 in the afternoon. He had a laptop connected to a projector screen behind him. He pulled up dash camera footage from Belton's patrol vehicle, angled from the parking lot, showing nothing of what happened inside the diner, showing everything of what happened outside it. Brandon's car pulling in 14 minutes before the incident. Brandon sitting in the car. Brandon getting out, straightening his jacket, walking to the door with a purpose that, cut from its context, stripped of the card in his pocket, and the 14-hour drive, and the smile he had been rehearsing, could be made to look like something it was not. "We have questions," Harvin said carefully, "about the timeline of events and the intentions of the individual involved." He did not use the word premeditation. He didn't need to. The cameras did the rest. The comment sections shifted by Friday morning. 3 national outlets reassigned their reporters. The senator's office stopped returning Clover's calls. By Saturday night, 12 days since it all began, Brandon was sitting at Pearl's kitchen table at 2 in the morning. He hadn't slept properly in nearly 2 weeks. The preliminary hearing was 4 days away. Clover was temporarily sidelined. The federal review was frozen. A paid witness was about to take a stand. His entire military career, 18 years, every deployment, every commendation, was sitting on a clock that was running down. Pearl sat across from him. She reached over and put her hand on top of his. "They are very good," she said quietly, "at making people feel like they've already lost." She let that sit for a moment. "They're not as good at actually winning." Brandon looked at her. "What do you know that I don't?" Pearl was quiet for just a moment. Then, "Call David Monroe. Tonight." The kitchen clock read 2:15. Brandon picked up his phone and dialed from memory. It rang once, twice. Then, "Brandon." Commander David Monroe's voice was alert, unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent 20 years training himself to be fully present within 2 seconds of waking up. "I've been waiting for this call." Brandon straightened slightly in his chair. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've been sitting on something since day 1, David said, "and I needed you to be in the right place before I told you about it." A pause. "Are you in the right place?" Pearl watched her son's face across the table. "Tell me," Brandon said. David Monroe had spent 6 years as an IT security specialist before his naval commission. Most people who knew him now, who knew him as the calm, exacting officer who had commanded Brandon's team through 3 deployments, didn't know that part. It wasn't something David advertised. It was, however, something he had put to very specific use on the morning Brandon called from the county jail. "When you called me from booking," David said, "I did 2 things. The first thing you know about, I started making calls, getting the footage out, finding Clover. The second thing I did before any of that, before I even called the first teammate, was file a formal complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General." Brandon was very still. "On what grounds?" "Potential civil rights violations involving active military personnel by local law enforcement," David said. The complaint triggered a mandatory federal evidence preservation request under the Stored Communications Act. It required the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department to preserve and produce all digital recordings related to the incident from that day. Every camera, every device, every upload. A pause. Every single one. They had no choice. The request was filed through proper federal channels, and it was airtight. Pearl watched Brandon absorb this. She saw the moment it landed. "Belton's body camera," Brandon said. "Belton's body camera," David confirmed. His department-issued smartphone was synced to the Sheriff's Department Cloud Evidence Management System. Standard practice for that department. Automatic upload every 90 seconds. Belton switched his camera on when he entered the diner. Standard protocol. Officers are required to activate body cameras before entering a potential confrontation. It ran for 93 seconds before he manually shut it off. David's voice was completely even. "He thought he turned it off before he reached your mother's table. He was 7 seconds too late." The kitchen was absolutely silent. "The upload happened automatically," David continued. 93 seconds of footage sitting in the county's evidence server. Harvin didn't know the DOD request had frozen it in place. Nobody touched it. Nobody deleted it. It has been sitting there since that Saturday morning, fully preserved and legally untouchable. Brandon pressed his fist flat against the table. Just once. Then he uncurled his hand. "What's on it?" he asked, though he already knew. "Everything," David said. "The approach, your mother's response, what Belton said to her. It's audible, Brandon." The microphone picked it up clearly, her hand on his chest, the slap. A pause. All of it. Pearl set down her coffee cup. She set it down very slowly, very carefully, and then she kept her hands wrapped around it because she needed something to hold on to. Not from weakness. From the particular, almost overwhelming feeling of something that had been very wrong beginning, just beginning, to tip toward right. "Does Clover know?" Brandon asked. "He will in about 4 minutes," David said. "I wanted you to hear it first." Brandon looked at his mother across the table. Pearl looked back at him. Her eyes were bright and clear and completely dry. She exhaled. Slow, controlled, the deliberate breath of a woman releasing something she had been carrying for 10 days straight. She wrapped both hands tighter around her coffee cup. "The bar complaint against Clover," Brandon said. "The federal review delay. Sims. All of it. Bought them nothing," David said. "The preservation request predates all of it. The footage was locked before Harvin ran a single play." Another pause. They built their whole wall around a foundation that was already gone. Brandon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "David." "Yeah, thank you." David Monroe said, "Bring her home safe, Brandon. That's all the thanks I need." The call ended. Brandon set the phone on the table. He looked at his mother. Really looked at her, the way he had looked at her across that diner floor 10 days ago. The same steadiness in her eyes that had been there every day of his life. Pearl almost smiled. "Well," she said quietly, "go ahead and call Clover." Pearl was up at 5:30. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the street outside lighten from black to gray to the pale, thin blue of an early Monday morning. Brandon was still asleep upstairs. She had heard him go up just before 3, after he and Clover had been on the phone for nearly 40 minutes. She had sat at the table the whole time, listening to the low sound of her son's voice through the ceiling, the measured back and forth of two men planning something careful and exact. She had finally gone to bed at 4. She didn't sleep much, but she didn't need to. At 8:15, her phone buzzed on the table. Clover. She answered before the second ring. "The bar complaint was dismissed 40 minutes ago," he said. "I'm filing the evidence motion now." Almond Clover filed the emergency motion at 8:23 Monday morning. It was built entirely around David Monroe's DoD preservation request, a single airtight legal instrument that compelled the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department to produce all preserved digital recordings from the day of the incident. No interpretation required. No room for delay tactics or procedural maneuvering. The federal preservation order had been in place since day one. The footage existed. The law said, produce it. By 10 o'clock, the Sheriff's Department's county attorney had filed a response objecting on jurisdictional grounds. Judge Kyler overruled it in writing in under 20 minutes. The footage arrived at the federal courthouse at 1:45 that afternoon. Clover called Pearl at 2 o'clock. "It's here. We're viewing it now." Pearl sat down. The clip ran 93 seconds. It began with the visual of Mabel's interior from the chest-mounted angle of Belton's body camera. The booths, the counter, the families at their tables, the gospel playing low from the kitchen radio. Belton moving through the room, approaching table 4. The audio was clear. The camera's microphone was department-grade, designed for exactly this kind of documentation. Then Belton leaning down, his voice dropping. And the words he said to Pearl Durnell, the words that had only been known until this moment by the 4 people sitting at table 4, coming through the speakers of a federal courtroom with absolute, irrefutable clarity. Clover told Pearl later that Harvin's county attorney had requested a recess at the 42nd mark. He walked out of the building and did not come back. Clover spent the remainder of Monday afternoon in Judge Kyler's chambers, where the Federal Review, freed from its 2-week delay the moment the footage resolved every contested question of fact, resumed with full force. Kyler was thorough. She watched the clip twice. She asked Clover 2 questions. She made 3 notes on a legal pad and said she would have preliminary findings within 48 hours. Before he left the courthouse, Clover filed a second motion simultaneously, a formal public records request demanding the release of the body camera footage under Georgia's Open Records Act. The footage was government property, captured on a government device, preserved through a federal order. It belonged to the public record. The department had 72 hours to comply or contest. They did not contest. Clover forwarded the footage to Jenny Dale at 6:47 Monday evening with a single line, "It's yours. Use it well." Jenny already had her report open. She had been building it since the previous Tuesday. 14 months of documentation structured into a single, comprehensive, 12,000-word piece that connected every thread. Belton's buried complaints, the NDA payments, Harvin's protection mechanism, Dillon's development scheme, the Shell nonprofit, the systematic harassment of Reedside businesses. She had the documents. She had the sources. She had the paper trail laid out so clearly that a reader with no prior knowledge of any of it could follow it from the first paragraph to the last without losing the thread once. What she hadn't had until 6:47 Monday evening was the footage. Now she had everything. She worked through the night. Brandon called at 9 to check on Pearl, and Jenny told him, "Go to sleep. Both of you. You'll want to be rested for tomorrow." She said it with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew exactly what tomorrow was going to look like. At 11:47 Tuesday night, Jenny sat back in her chair and read the final paragraph of the piece one last time. Then she called Pearl. "It publishes tomorrow morning," she said. Pearl was already in bed, but not asleep. She had been lying in the dark, listening to the quiet of the house, Brandon breathing down the hall, the oak tree moving outside her window. "Every word?" Pearl said. "Every word," Jenny said. Pearl closed her eyes. "Good night, Jenny," she said. "Good night, Pearl." Jenny Dale had not slept. She had been at her desk since Monday evening, when Almond Clover forwarded her the public records request he had been preparing for 6 days. the formal legal mechanism that compelled the sheriff's department to release Belton's body camera footage to the press under Georgia's open records law. The footage arrived in her inbox at 11:47 Tuesday night, attached to a 3-line email from Clover's paralegal. Jenny watched it once, with the sound up. Then she sat in the quiet of her repaired front office. New glass in the window frame, the display case still cracked, but cleaned up. And she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes to feel the full weight of what she was holding. The approach. Belton's voice dropping low. Pearl's hand flat on his chest. The slap. All of it. Clear and damning and irrefutable. Then she went back to work. At 6 o'clock Wednesday morning, the front page of the Millhaven Courier's website went live with the most important piece of journalism Jenny Dale had written in 40 years. 12,000 words. 14 months of documentation. The body camera footage embedded at the top, autoplaying without sound. 3 separate sections: Belton's buried complaint history, Harvin's protection mechanism, and the full paper trail of Dylan's development scheme, each one sourced, documented, and airtight. Every word of it, every second of that footage, all of it, in the open, where no cease and desist letter could touch it. By 6:45, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had picked it up. By 7:30, it was on 4 national wire services. By 8 o'clock, Pearl's phone had received 47 missed calls. She was already sitting at her kitchen table when Brandon came downstairs, dressed and alert. He had slept, actually slept, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. And the difference in his face was visible. He looked at his mother. She slid her laptop across the table so he could see the screen. He read in silence for a long moment. "Jenny," he said quietly. Not a question. Just the name, said, like it meant something. 40 years she's been doing this, Pearl said. She was ready. The FBI field office in Atlanta was formally activated before 9 o'clock. Agent Simone Barker had been building toward this moment for 11 months. She had her own files, her own sources, her own documented case that had been waiting for exactly this convergence. Public evidence, federal record, and a story that the entire country was already watching. The Courier's publication gave her everything she needed to move. She moved fast. Federal investigators reached Gary Sims at his home at 10:15 Wednesday morning. They sat across from him at his kitchen table and placed in front of him a printed record of 17 phone calls, incoming and outgoing, between his personal cell phone and a number registered to Dylan Development Partners, all made in the 5 days between the incident at Mabel's and the moment he signed his witness statement. Sims looked at the phone records for a long time. Then he looked at the 2 federal agents across his table. He recanted his statement at 10:53. He signed a new declaration, witnessed, notarized, filed with the federal court before noon, stating that he had not been present at Mabel's diner on the morning in question, and that his original statement had been provided in exchange for a payment of $3,000, delivered in cash, by a man he knew as a contractor who had worked on a Dylan development site. By Thursday morning, D.A. Wilbert Rush's office was very quiet. His assistant called Almond Clover at 8:45. Rush himself came on the line 2 minutes later. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He said, in the careful, flat language of a man reading from something his own attorney had written, "The evidentiary basis for prosecution no longer supports the charges against Brandon Durnell. We will be filing a motion to dismiss today." Clover said, "I'll be reviewing the filing before you submit it." There was a pause. "Of course," Rush said. Clover called Brandon immediately. Brandon was standing in Pearl's kitchen when the call came through. Pearl was at the stove, her back to the room, stirring something she had been making since 6 o'clock that neither of them had eaten yet. Brandon listened, said very little. When he hung up, he set the phone on the counter. "It's dismissed," he said. Pearl did not turn around immediately. She stood at the stove, stirring slowly, and the only sound in the kitchen was the low bubble of whatever was in that pot. Then she turned off the burner, set down the spoon, turned around. She looked at her son standing in her kitchen, whole, free, unbroken, and something moved across her face that had no clean name, not triumph. Deeper than that, the particular, bone-level relief of a woman who had refused to stop believing in something for 14 days straight, and had been right. She opened her arms. Brandon crossed the kitchen. Friday came in cold and dark. Pearl was standing on her front porch at 6:15 in the morning when the first FBI vehicle rolled quietly through Reedside. Then a second. Then a third. Dark, unmarked, moving with the unhurried certainty of something that had been planned down to the minute. She watched them pass Auburn Street and felt something settle in her chest, heavy and clean, like the last piece of a very long equation finally resolving. Brandon appeared in the doorway behind her. He handed her a cup of coffee and stood beside her without speaking. They watched the street together in the early dark. By 8 o'clock, Pearl, Brandon, Jenny, and Brian Stewart were standing together on the sidewalk across from the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department. Jenny had her camera. Brian had brought a thermos of coffee nobody asked for, and everyone was grateful for. The morning was cold and bright, the kind of October day that made everything look sharp-edged and final. At 9:14, the FBI went in. 4 agents through the front door of the Sheriff's Department, moving the way people move when they have done something many times and feel no need to dramatize it. Pearl watched the door close behind them. The 4 of them stood on the sidewalk and waited. 8 minutes later, Arnie Belton came out, full uniform, badge still on, hands cuffed in front of him, a detail that Pearl noticed and filed away. The particular irony of a man being walked out in the same kind of restraints he had used on her son 15 days ago. He moved with his chin down and his eyes on the pavement. 2 agents flanked him, 1 at each elbow. The lobby full of his colleagues stood completely still as he passed through it. Not one of them moved. Not one of them said a word. An Atlanta news crew was set up on the sidewalk. They caught everything. Civil rights deprivation under color of law. Evidence falsification. Conspiracy. The federal charges were read into the public record before Belton's transport vehicle had cleared the parking lot. Brian Stewart exhaled slowly beside Pearl. A long, low breath he seemed to have been holding for 15 days. Pearl said nothing. She watched until the vehicle turned the corner and disappeared. At 10:02, Agent Simone Barker knocked on Chris Harvin's front door. He answered it in civilian clothes, khakis and a collared shirt, like a man who had been expecting company, but had hoped it might be someone else. His wife appeared behind him in the hallway, one hand on the door frame. Harvin looked at Barker, looked at the agents behind her. He said nothing. He simply turned around, and Pearl heard later from Jenny, who had a source inside the federal task force, that he never said a single word from that moment until he was processed and seated and formally charged. Civil rights conspiracy. Obstruction of justice. Wire fraud. The ceiling had become the floor. At 11:30, federal agents walked into the Atlanta high-rise offices of Dillon Development Partners and placed Preston Dillon under arrest at his own conference table in front of his own staff, in the middle of what had apparently been a routine project meeting. His firm received a federal asset freeze before lunch. The $47 million Reedside development project, the condominiums that were going to stand where Mabel's diner stood, where Pearl's church stood, where 3 generations of black families had built their lives, was dead before noon. At 2 o'clock, D.A. Wilbert Rush's resignation letter was emailed to the county commissioner's office. 3 sentences. No explanation. No apology. At 4:45, Judge Pickett issued a recusal notice from all pending county cases, citing the need for an independent judicial conduct review. He would not return to the bench. 5 men. One Friday. That evening, the 4 of them sat in Pearl's living room with the television on. The 6 o'clock news led with Belton's arrest. The footage of him being walked through the lobby playing on a loop. The Atlanta crew's clean shot of his face as he cleared the door. Then Harvin. Then Dillon. The anchor read the charges clearly and without editorializing, and the words filled Pearl's living room like something long overdue finally being spoken aloud. Brian Stewart shook his head slowly at the screen. Jenny had her notebook open on her knee, writing. Brandon sat forward with his elbows on his thighs and his hands folded, watching in silence. Pearl sat in her chair with her coffee cup in both hands. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. 6 weeks is not a long time. 6 weeks is not long enough to fully process what happened, or to stop waking up some mornings with the particular heaviness that settles into a person after they have been through something that tested everything they were made of. 6 weeks is not long enough to forget the sound of a cell door, or the sight of a handprint on your mother's face, or the 14 days when the whole weight of a corrupt system was stacked deliberately and methodically against everything you loved. But 6 weeks, Brandon had discovered, was long enough to begin. He pulled into Mabel's parking lot on a Saturday morning in November and sat in his car for a moment, not composing himself this time, not rehearsing anything, just sitting, watching the morning light on Auburn Street. The oak trees had lost most of their leaves, and the November sky was the pale, clean gray of a world that had been through something and was still standing. He got out of the car and went inside. The diner was full. Not crowded, full. The particular fullness of a place that is exactly what it is supposed to be, with exactly the people who are supposed to be in it. The booths along the back wall, the counter stools, the gospel on the radio behind the kitchen window, the smell of biscuits and butter and something with heat coming through from the back. Everything exactly where it had always been. The window that the brick had never touched, that had been Jenny's office, was Mabel's window, and it was intact. It had always been intact. Pearl had clarified that detail for the 3rd time last week when a reporter got it wrong again, with the particular patience of a woman who understood that the truth required regular maintenance. Ruthie Monroe was at table 4, already into her 2nd cup of coffee by the look of it. She saw Brandon come through the door and broke into a smile that took up her whole face. Brian Stewart was beside her. Brian Stewart, 74 years old, retired postal worker. A man who had been in love with Pearl Durnell since 1987 and had spent 37 years finding elaborate reasons not to say so. Brian Stewart had finally, in the weeks following everything, told Pearl exactly how he felt. Pearl had looked at him for a long moment and said she had known since 1989, and that if he didn't stop wasting both their time, she would be genuinely annoyed. Brian Stewart had laughed until he couldn't breathe. He was now, by any observable measure, the happiest man in Millhaven County. Jenny was at the counter with her laptop open. She was always writing. The 6-part investigative series had been submitted for a National Journalism Award 3 weeks ago, and the ceremony, when she won it, because she would win it, Pearl had stated this as plain fact, would be held at Cornerstone Baptist, because Jenny Dale had decided that if she was going to accept an award, she was going to accept it in the room that mattered most to her. Brandon stopped at the counter and put his hand briefly on Jenny's shoulder as he passed. She reached up and covered it with hers without looking away from her screen. Pearl was at table 4. She looked up when Brandon arrived and watched him cross the diner the way she had watched him cross rooms his entire life, with that particular unhurried certainty that had always been his, even as a small boy, even before he knew what to do with it. She had a cup of coffee waiting at the empty seat across from her. She had not asked Mabel to bring it. It had simply appeared because Mabel knew, and Mabel always would. Brandon sat down. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Judge Kyler's ruling had been entered into the public record 10 days ago. All charges vacated, expunged. The prosecution formally noted as a coordinated civil rights suppression effort. Brandon's military record was untouched. His pension was secure. His separation from the Navy had been processed cleanly, his 18 years of service honored and intact. 3 days ago, he had accepted a position with Georgia's newly formed Civil Rights Enforcement Division, a federally supported unit built specifically to investigate patterns of law enforcement misconduct in small jurisdictions. It was not the work he had trained for. It was, he had slowly come to understand, the work he had always been moving toward. Pearl looked at him across the table. "Are you staying?" she asked. Brandon looked at the room, the photographs on the walls, the regulars at their tables, Jenny at the counter, Brian Stewart laughing at something Ruthie had said, the sound of Mabel in the kitchen. The particular quality of the morning light through the window that had been there since 1967 and intended to remain considerably longer. "I'm staying," he said. Pearl nodded once. She picked up her coffee cup, settled back in her chair, and looked out at Auburn Street, her neighborhood, her 30 years of Saturday mornings that no one had managed to take from her. She didn't say anything more. She never needed to make a production out of being right. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.